Hello, my name is Holger Schünemann. I work at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, and I will be providing an introduction to WHO guidelines in grade. The first module focuses on the introduction and an overview of trustworthy guidelines. This course comprises 6 modules. They are narrated based on slides. There are separate quizzes, and you can go at your own pace. The 6 modules include this introduction, a module on the development of WHO guidelines with an overview of practical issues in WHO guideline development, a module on grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation, in other words, the grade approach to assessing the certainty of evidence. The 4th module will focus on the grade evidence to recommendation and decision frameworks and include other evidence to recommendation frameworks. The 5th module will deal with adopting, adapting, and de novo creation of guidelines using the grade development approach. And the 6th module will focus on practical guideline adoption, adaptation, and de novo creation. Before I start, here are my disclosures. I do not have any direct financial conflicts. However, I'm co-chair of the GRADE Working Group and have contributed to the GRADE Working Group for over 20 years now. I'm director of Cochrane Canada. I'm on the board of the Guidelines International Network, and I have received funding from the World Health Organization for this work that has been given to my university. The views expressed here are my own. So this is module 1. And as I said, it is an introduction and overview of what constitutes a trustworthy guideline. But before, why do we develop guidelines? Trustworthy guidelines explicitly consider the desirable and undesirable consequences of alternative options for a population facing a health question. The principles for WHO guidelines include that they address uncertainty and an unmet need for guidance to address the questions that I just mentioned. The principles reflect the core WHO value of the right to health. The user can see how and why a recommendation was developed, by whom, and on what basis. They also include a systematic and comprehensive assessment of the balance of a policy's or intervention's potential benefits and harms, and explicit considerations of other relevant factors. The underlying evidence is publicly available. Recommendations can be implemented in and adapted to local settings and contexts. And guidelines can be tailored to a specific audience. They can include public health policymakers, health program managers, healthcare providers, patients, caregivers, the general public, and other stakeholders. The WHO definition of guidelines is similar to the following. A guideline includes systematically developed evidence-based statements which assist providers, recipients, and other stakeholders to make informed decisions about appropriate health interventions. Health interventions are defined broadly to include not only clinical procedures, but also public health and policy actions. They should be based on evidence, but usually require consensus. In fact, the new era of guidelines promises recommendations that are based on the best available evidence, summarized in systematic reviews, while providing the necessary flexibility needed to individualize decisions if necessary. They are often misunderstood and misconstrued as meaning that experts are now meaningless in the process, or as if consensus through discussion is a matter of the past. Experts indeed are responsible for prioritization of questions that should be addressed in a guideline, judgments that result from interpretation of the available evidence, and judgments around the rating of the certainty of the evidence, and decisions about how the judgments on different criteria that influence a recommendation actually bear on that recommendation. But what is a recommendation? A recommendation is an actionable statement. A guideline contains one or more recommendations. This depends on the topic that is covered. They address different types of guideline questions, including public health, clinical, and health policy, as I mentioned. Here are a few examples from different WHO guidelines. For instance, from a tuberculosis guideline that describes what type of medicines should be used for multi-drug resistant or rifampicin resistant tuberculosis when they receive a longer regimen. There often is a rating of the certainty of the evidence and how strong the recommendation is. There's another example from a chest imaging guideline on the diagnosis and management of COVID-19, and another policy type of guideline that deals with environmental or engineering measures to reduce the transmission of tuberculosis. But what is the anatomy of a guideline? It starts with a question. It includes the evidence. It includes judgments and the recommendation. Here are examples for how a question, for instance, is formulated. In people living with tuberculosis, should intervention or option A or B be used? The evidence that would include a description such as a systematic review of a number of trials or observational studies shows the following. Judgments about how large the potential health benefits are and how large the harms are, whether or not the intervention is feasible, equitable, acceptable, cost-effective, and so on. And then the recommendation. The WHO Guideline Development Group, for instance, recommends use of A rather than B in people with tuberculosis. This slide shows a broad overview of how a guideline process actually evolves. Obviously, it starts with good organization, budgeting, planning, and appropriate training of panel members or guideline development group members, as well as other potential groups involved in the development. That is typically done by a steering group at WHO. This diagram also shows that conflict of interest considerations are critical from the very beginning to the very end of the circular process. Furthermore, the diagram shows that documenting the guideline development process and eventual decisions is critical. As I mentioned, there are different groups involved. For instance, at WHO, there is a guideline review committee, here entitled Oversight Committee, that approves topics, sets rules, and actually approves the final recommendations. There are outside stakeholders that may have a role in setting priorities. There's the guideline development group called Guideline Panel here, and there are working groups, such as, for instance, a systematic review team or a technical advisor. There's also observers sometimes involved. And the process starts with setting a priority, developing questions, typically following the population interventions, comparators, and outcomes approach that clearly describes who's the target audience and how the topic has been selected. It includes summarizing the evidence and considering additional information, which is often done by systematic review teams or usually done by them. And these systematic reviews may include systematic reviews about intervention effects, diagnostic tests, prognosis. They may include reviews or original research about how important the outcomes are that are affected by an intervention. What are the underlying preferences and values of the population? How large is the baseline risk? What is the burden of disease? what resources are required, what are the effects on equity, and other type of information such as feasibility and acceptability. That often is then associated with judging the quality, strength, or certainty of a body of evidence. These are just different terms for the same meaning. And the guideline development group then considers all of that in developing recommendations and determining their strength. Recommendations are then appropriately worded to be understood. They are reported and peer-reviewed, beginning with the Guideline Review Committee. They are disseminated and implemented and then evaluated after they are being used or while they are being used. And of course, they must be updated if new evidence arises. This slide shows another overview of guideline development. Again, it requires planning, development, reporting, and then often appraisal either within or outside of the organization. There are many standards that have led to accepting certain approaches at WHO and other organizations. For instance, the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation group that I mentioned initially has developed a rating system for the certainty of evidence and how to move from evidence to recommendations. In 2006, a series of articles was published that evaluated how WHO is using evidence, what WHO was currently doing to develop recommendations, what other organizations were doing, and what WHO might want to do to develop guidelines and recommendations, which eventually led to the WHO Handbook for Guideline Development, which is, as of 2021, available in its second edition. There are other groups, such as the Institute of Medicine, that has developed standards for clinical practice guidelines one can trust. The Guidelines International Network has developed standards for guideline development. And all of those together have fairly similar concepts or underlying principles that I will be reviewing on the next slides. Before I go there, there are tools that can be utilized to develop guidelines. A prominent tool is the Guidelines International Network McMaster Guideline Development Tool and Checklist that is available in a software application called GradePro, and it covers planning, development, and reporting of guidelines. There are reporting tools such as the WRITE tool and the AGREE guideline reporting tool. And there are appraisal tools, also an AGREE tool, the NEEDS instrument, and instruments such as panel view that focus on what really happens in a guideline development group during the development of recommendations. Let me return to what characterizes a good guideline recommendation. Here are the 6 principles. First, a recommendation should be based on a systematic review of the existing evidence that is the best available evidence. It should be developed by a knowledgeable, multidisciplinary panel of experts and representatives from key affected groups, in other words, by a diverse group. It should consider important patient or people subgroups and patient or people preferences as appropriate, in other words, people's values. Should provide a clear explanation of the logical relationships between alternative care options and health outcomes, and provide ratings of both the certainty of evidence and the strength of a recommendation. This should be considered and revised as appropriate when important new evidence warrants modifications of recommendations. And finally, they should be based on an explicit and transparent process that minimizes distortions, bias, and conflict of interest. Let me explain these principles in slightly more detail. So first, recommendations should be based on a systematic review of the existing evidence that is the best available evidence. What is the systematic review? A systematic review attempts to identify, appraise, and synthesize all the empirical evidence that meets pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a specific research question. That's a definition from the Cochrane collaboration, a prominent organization in developing systematic reviews and a key partner of the World Health Organization. Those conducting systematic reviews use explicit systematic methods that are selected with a view aimed at minimizing bias in the review process to produce more reliable findings to inform decision-making. The type of questions that can be addressed by a systematic review include interventions, test accuracy, prognosis. They can be qualitative in nature. They can address values. Guideline development groups have the option to conduct or use systematic reviews that have already been done. And the brief process of a systematic review includes defining the question, planning eligibility criteria, developing the appropriate methods, searching for studies or evidence, applying eligibility criteria, collecting the data, assessing the risk of bias in the evidence, analyzing and presenting results, and grading and interpreting results, and then drawing conclusions. Here are a few examples of the types of reviews that exist. They are broad. They can address different topics such as policies or complex interventions. They can be based on individual participant data. They can be a systematic review and include a meta-analysis, a statistical summary of the results, and they may be living in nature. The second principle is that a guideline recommendation should be developed by a knowledgeable, multidisciplinary panel of experts and representatives from key affected groups. In other words, by a diverse group. They should include relevant technical experts, end users such as program managers and health professionals who will adopt, adapt, and implement the guideline, representatives of groups most affected by the recommendations in the guideline, such as service users and representatives of disadvantaged groups. Should include experts in assessing evidence and developing guidelines informed by such evidence, and other technical experts as required, for instance, a health economist or an expert on equity, human rights, and gender. A guideline recommendation should consider important patient or people subgroups and patient preferences as appropriate. In other words, people's values. That includes determining what subgroups exist and whether or not they are part of the people addressed in the recommendation or if they need specific separate recommendations. That includes how much people value the main outcomes related to the options of interest that are addressed in the recommendation. That can be informed by systematic reviews. Here, an example from a guideline by the American Society of Hematology. And it should include a judgment whether or not there's important uncertainty or variability in how much people actually value these outcomes. And that should be made transparent. The next principle is that guideline recommendations should include an explanation of the logical relationships between alternative care options and health outcomes, as well as provide ratings of both the certainty of evidence and the strength of recommendations. The World Health Organization and over 100 other organizations use an approach that is called the GRADE approach. GRADE is a transparent and structured approach that helps users or those conducting a guideline development effort to judge how certain one is about a body of evidence addressing a specific questions. The questions that are asked are, what are the limitations of the included studies? Are the results consistent when they should be consistent? Are the results precise or due to random error? How directly do the actual studies that provide the evidence apply to the population or setting, the interventions and the outcomes that are of interest, whether or not we really have identified all the research that exists, or if publication bias exists, or if there are any other issues that increase our confidence in the real results. So for instance, when there are large effects or dose-response relations. GRADE also acknowledges that just summarizing the evidence is not enough. Judgments are required, and GRADE offers a framework to help reaching decisions and making recommendations by evaluating health benefits and harms, the resources that are required, considering equity, feasibility, acceptability, and so on. There are often different terms that are utilized to express the same concepts. For instance, human rights are considered here. Legal frameworks may be considered here under those criteria. WHO also uses other frameworks, including the WHO Integrate framework, that addresses similar issues. The next principle includes that recommendations should be reconsidered and revised as appropriate when important new evidence warrants modifications of these recommendations. Here an example of when a new medicine, bedaquiline, was introduced to the market, and WHO developed sequential guideline recommendations, also called policy guidance, on the use of bedaquiline. This timeline shows a very brief overview of the type of data and studies that were available, including randomized trials, observational studies, and then an individual participant data meta-analysis of observational studies that informed updated recommendations. You also see here that over time, the certainty in any evidence of the effects, for instance, on mortality, increased. Recommendations should be based on an explicit and transparent process that minimizes distortions, biases, and conflicts of interest. This is a very important principle. WHO and many other organizations have been criticized in the distant past of undue influence due to conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is an important potential source of bias and diminishes credibility in the development of WHO guidelines. One definition is that a conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that creates a risk that professional judgment or any other judgment or actions regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. Therefore, WHO and other organizations carefully collect any disclosure of interest from participating individuals in the guideline development process, including the guideline development group, technical advisors, as well as guideline development group members that, for instance, have participated online, or systematic review teams. They assess these disclosures of interest and then manage conflicts of interest either by excluding potential members, by recusing them, or letting them weigh in only on specific questions. In summary, guidelines contain recommendations and other useful information that inform decisions about health. The development, adoption, and adaptation of recommendations requires adherence to standards that have been set by key organizations. The use of best evidence, involvement of multiple stakeholders, considerations of people's values, transparency, rating of the certainty of the evidence and recommendations, updating and management of any conflicts of interest are key considerations. Next, in this module are quiz questions. And the way that this works is that I will ask you to try to answer the questions before I continue to the next slide. We have only a few questions, and then you are done with this module. Question number 1. Guideline development groups include only public health and clinical experts. True or false? Think about it. And I will go on. The answer is false. WHO guideline development groups are multidisciplinary and typically include citizens and people affected by the condition. Question number 2. Guideline recommendations are typically based on expert opinion alone. True or false? I will go on. Make up your mind. The answer is false. Guideline recommendations are based on evidence, its interpretation, and judgments about that evidence that lead to opinions. Opinions are offered by multiple stakeholders, but the process to develop a recommendation is transparent and based on transparent judgments. Last question, number 3. Trustworthy guideline recommendations should be based on the best available evidence, consider people's values, declare, consider, and manage interests of guideline group members, be agreed on with industry representatives that produce interventions of interest. 1, 2, and 3. Think about it. The answer is 1, 2, and 3. Guidelines should use the best available evidence, multiple stakeholders, considerations of people's values, transparency, rating of the certainty of the evidence and recommendations, updating and management of any conflicts of interest, as already mentioned. This is the end of this presentation. If you would like to reach me directly, here's my contact information. Thank you very much.